Hello, I'm George, and welcome to IELTS 100. In this lesson on the writing of IELTS, I'm going to introduce two other common mistakes that can easily prevent you from meeting and exceeding the second and the third descriptors under grammatical range and accuracy for the band score of 7 for both Task 1 and Task 2. To achieve the band score of 7, candidates need to produce frequent error-free sentences, have good control of grammar and punctuation, but may make a few errors. Please note, if you're making the following two mistakes, you may not meet these two descriptors for a band score of 7 in the area of grammatical range and accuracy. So, without further ado, let's get started. Mistake number 1. Fragments. The word fragment means a piece or a part of something. When you make a fragment mistake, you use part of a sentence as a complete sentence. This mistake is an unacceptable mistake for the band score of 7 or higher. Look at two very common fragments used by IELTS candidates. People need to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels, period, because the threat of climate change is no longer an idle threat, period. Because the threat of climate change is no longer an idle threat, cannot stand alone as a complete sentence, as it is a dependent clause. A dependent clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb that cannot stand alone. For more information about dependent clauses, watch Lesson 5 on complex sentences. Look at another example. Fossil fuel consumption rose slightly from 1900s to 1960, period. After there was a sharp rise in the consumption of fossil fuels between 1960 and 2020. After there was a sharp rise in the consumption of fossil fuels between 1960 and 2020 is also a fragment and therefore cannot be used as a complete sentence. Now, to fix your fragments, you have 3 easy ways. Remove the subordinating conjunction. Subordinating conjunctions such as because and after are words that can be added to the beginning of a clause to turn them into dependent clauses. For example, the clause, "There was a sharp rise in the consumption of fossil fuels between 1960 and 2020 is an independent clause, which is a group of words with a subject and a verb that can stand alone. But when you add the word after to the beginning of the clause, you turn it into a dependent clause, which cannot be used by itself anymore. So, to fix the fragment, you can easily remove the word after or any subordinating conjunction for that matter. For a list of subordinating conjunctions, please watch video lesson 5 on complex sentences. Now, the correct structure would be fossil fuel consumption rose slightly from 1900s to 1960, period. There was a sharp rise in the consumption of fossil fuels between 1960 and 2020. But sometimes you cannot easily remove the subordinating conjunction, as it is very necessary for what you would like to communicate to keep the conjunction. In this case, you need to see if you can combine the fragment with a sentence before or a sentence after. So, by combining the fragment with the sentence before it, we get the following sentence, which is structurally correct. People need to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels because the threat of climate change is no longer an idle threat. Period. If combining the fragment with a sentence before or after does not work, you may need to complete the fragment by adding an independent clause to it. Here is an example. People need to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels. Period. Because the threat of climate change is no longer an idle threat, comma, many governments are encouraging people to use green sources of energy. In this revision, I have added a new independent clause, which is many governments are encouraging people to use green sources of energy, to the fragment. Mistake number 2. Incorrect parallel structures. The word parallel means similar. So parallel structures are basically structures that have the same form. When writing, you will have to list some ideas in a sentence. The ideas that you would like to list in a sentence must be put in parallel structures, which means you will have to use the same structures. Let's take a look at an example. Governments can reduce the consumption of fossil fuels by subsidizing green energies and implementing carbon pricing. In this sentence, the two strategies to combat climate change are listed in parallel structures. Subsidizing and implementing have the same form. They both are gerunds. A gerund is a verb ending in ing. Now, let's see an incorrect parallel structure. People can reduce their carbon footprint by reusing old items, recycling trash, and by using public transit. In this sentence, the first item in the series is reusing, which is a gerund. The second one is recycling, which is also a gerund. But the third one is by using, which is an extra preposition. So to fix the sentence, you need to write, people can reduce their carbon footprint by reusing old items, recycling trash, and using public transit. In this sentence, as you can see, all gerunds follow the first preposition by. Parallel structures are usually joined together using conjunctions such as and, or, and but. However, there are 4 other conjunctions that are called paired or correlative conjunctions. The reason they're called paired conjunctions is that they have 2 parts. These conjunctions are both and, neither nor, either or, not only, but also. The rule of parallel structures dictates that the form that is used after a pair must be exactly the same as the form that follows the other pair. Look at this incorrect sentence, which does not follow the rule. The governments can both implement carbon pricing and can subsidize green energies. This sentence does not follow the rule of parallel structures for paired conjunctions. As you can see, what goes after both is implement carbon pricing, which begins with the base form of a verb. But what goes after and is can subsidize green energies, which begins with the modal verb can, followed by the base verb subsidize. To fix the sentence, you need to remove the second can. The government can both implement carbon pricing and subsidize green energies. Here is another incorrect use of parallel structures after paired conjunctions. According to the new environmental regulations, factories can either pay a higher price on their carbon emissions, or they can cut down on their emissions by using less carbon-intensive production processes. In this sentence, after either, the writer has written, pay a higher price on their carbon emissions, which begins with the base form pay, but after or, you see they can cut down, which begins with the subject followed by the modal verb followed by the base form of the verb. So, to fix the error, we need to make sure the two sides are parallel or similar. According to the new environmental regulations, factories can either pay a higher price on their carbon emissions or cut down on their emissions by using less carbon-intensive production processes. This is the end of Lesson 2. Please make sure you watch and practice this lesson as many times as required before moving on to the next lesson. In my next lesson, I will teach you how to avoid two other mistakes, namely dangling and misplaced modifiers. In the meantime, make sure to subscribe to my channel for the most recent video lessons.